start in chapter 24, number 35, I promise. It may take me an entire year before I get through the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. You remember from the last two Bible studies, we were in chapter 23, where he's been debating the religious leaders. He gave parables about them. It was just a bad situation. So now he leaves the temple, and his disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all of these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another, that shall not be thrown down." Now as they sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when these things will be, and what the sign of your coming and the end of the age." This is often referred to as the Olivet Discourse, because it took place on the Mount of Olives. And you can imagine in your mind Jesus and his disciples leaving. They go across the Kidron Valley up to the Mount of Olives that overlooks all of Jerusalem and the temple. And they sit down there, and Jesus gives his second longest teaching in the book of Matthew. Remember, the book of Matthew, he deals primarily writing to the Jews, but also he writes down what Jesus says. And that's where we have the largest discourse, and that's the Sermon on the Mount. And then the second one is the Olivet Discourse that we're talking about tonight. As they were sitting there, they were looking across at Herod's temple, and it was impressive, to say the least. It took 18,000 men 80 years to build it. From 20 BC to 64 AD, it took them 80 years, 18,000 men. It was massive. But what's really interesting is they finished it in 64 AD. In 70 AD, they only had it in operation completed 6 years before Titus Vespasian came and literally tore every single block down. Only 6 years. It took 80 years to build an entire generation of people. And in a matter of a couple months, it was completely down, one stone on top of another. In fact, they said later on that if you wouldn't have known there was a temple there, you would have never known it because it was so utterly destroyed. They would have never known it was even occupied. So it's pretty sad. You remember Jesus' temptation where Satan took him up to the pinnacle of the temple? Well, the pinnacle of the temple on the wall overlooks the Kidron Valley. And it's 158 feet from the top of the wall down to the base of the Kidron Valley. But further than that, when you go up to the mount itself, to the temple was 90 feet yet above that. So you can imagine how impressive it was in the entire valley. Because what you had the temple here, and you had a valley, and a valley. So they all three hills around it looked right at the temple, and as big as it was. But we have to, as we go through this, we want to be thinking not in the minds that we have, but how Jesus is describing it to his disciples, because it was to his disciples in their Jewish mind that he was explaining this end times. They had the idea that the return of the Messiah and his reign from Jerusalem on David's throne was all one setting. They didn't understand that he would come as a suffering servant and die for their sins, then leave and return to rule. They didn't understand that. They thought he'd come all at once. And so when the disciples are constantly asking questions about, well, who's going to reign with you, who's going to be on your right hand and your left side, they expected it to be within a few days. And so when they asked this question, tell us when these things will be, what sign of your coming and the end of the age, they're expecting, well, like next Tuesday, 3 or 4 days from now. They just saw him enter Jerusalem. This is the last week, remember? He enters Jerusalem as their king. Everybody accepts him as king. He goes into the temple, throws out all the money changers, all those people that are corrupting the religion. He's fought with all of the religious leaders. The only thing that the Messiah has left to do is overthrow Rome in the mind of the disciples. So they're asking this question, expecting an answer of, well, give me a few days and we'll take care of this. But they were thinking physically, not spiritually. And so Jesus, this is all the introduction, Jesus now gives them their answer. He starts in verse 4 with his discourse, and he answered them and said, "Take heed that no one deceives you." That's a very important phrase, and you need to search it out. We don't have time tonight, but you need to search it out through your New Testament. It's pretty impressive. But to start with, Jesus says, make sure that no one deceives you. And it's a really good place to put it, because when you go to study the Olivet Discourse, and Mark 13 and Luke 21 that have comparable speeches of Jesus saying these things, I don't think there's a single commentator that agrees. It's terrible. Everybody has different ideas and different emphasis of what Jesus says. It's very difficult to get a straight answer from anybody. And Jesus starts it out with saying, make sure that no one deceives you. And in our day and time, who do you believe? You have so many different ideas. Well, as you study it, you get the idea that one commentator says, well, I think this, or, well, I don't think it was just this. And that never fits, does it? Same thing with, like we talked about Sunday. When we define who God is, we always come up short. When we say, well, I think God would do this, but I don't think he'd do this, you may be right, you may be wrong, but who's the final authority? Well, God himself. And so as we go through this, I want you to picture in your mind that you're one of the disciples sitting on the Mount of Olives overlooking the temple as Jesus answers this. We've all got our preconceived notions. We've all done our own study. We've all heard pastors and Bible teachers talk about it. But tonight, let's just hear what Jesus has to say. And let's just take what he says and run with it. Let him define it. Let the chips fall where they may. And if they mess up some of our ideas, maybe we need to realign. But let's just hear it for the truth of what Jesus says about the end of time. Jesus says, make sure that no one deceives you. Verse 5, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all of these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All of these are the beginning of sorrows. You think about history. It's been 2,000 years since Jesus has this discussion. Humanity's gone through the Dark Ages. The Black Death. The Plague. World War I. World War II. Hamas shooting thousands of rockets in 1 week at Israel. Not but too long ago. We've had the Indonesian tsunami where countless people, we don't even know how many had died from one tsunami. Haiti's recent earthquakes, COVID, as bad as it is around the world, and all that's going to take place because of COVID. And Jesus says all of these things, this is just the beginning. Oh, it's going to get a lot worse. These are the beginning of sorrows. And actually, the word there for sorrows is actually birth pains. I don't know about you, Bethany, but I know with Sonia, and I don't know about my mother-in-law, but when she went to have the kids, she had all those Braxton Hicks that were false positives. But as you got closer, you realized that there were contractions that they weren't faking it anymore. And they got closer and more frequent and more painful and more severe until you got dilated and the doc says, it's time. We tried to have them all scheduled, but it never worked out. Only one of them did. only Hannah, right? Yeah, Hannah was the only one that She knew her time and place. Daniel and Natalie certainly didn't. But the same thing with these. Rumors of wars in nations, fighting against nation, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, all of these are the contractions that are beginning. Because the whole earth is groaning for its redemption. And the closer we get, the more they will become, the greater, more powerful, and the more frequent. Verse 8 says, all of those things are the beginning of sorrows. Verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will be betrayed one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end will be saved. You know, persecution hasn't slowed down just because the rest of the world has in COVID. The 20th century saw more Christian martyrs than all of the other centuries combined, and in the 21st century, those numbers have only gone up. Afghanistan right now are killing fields for Christians. We read this verse with that they will betray one another, verse 10, and will hate one another. And I was telling my family that I read an article where a dad turned his daughter over to the Taliban because she had got a job. And the atrocities that they did to her afterwards, it was her own father. And right now, people are turning Christians over to garner favor for the Taliban and the ISIS that are coming in as the rule, because they figure if they can turn over these Christians that they might be okay. And the things that are taking place, the atrocities are just horrific. It says, because of lawlessness, because it's abounding, the love of many will grow cold. And that is the word agapeo from chapter 13 of Corinthians. We must determine now in our hearts, in today's troubles, to hold on and to press through for the prize. Because he says here, he who endures to the end shall be saved. He didn't say, I'm going to make it easy for you. He didn't say, everything's going to be roses and all peaches and cream. No, we have to endure. We have to determine now in our lives that we will endure, that we're going to hold on no matter what. Because if we can't do it now in the easy times, what are we going to do when it gets difficult? Let's continue, verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all of the world as a witness to all of the nations, and then the end will come. Verse 14 is the tipping point. It's the alarm clock with no snooze button. When we get to this point, the end will come. The alarm will sound. God will say, it's time. Here we go. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him listen and understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, not go down and take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Verse 15, who wrote the book of Daniel? And Jesus said, Daniel did. So don't believe any seminary professor or liberally indoctrinated pastor tell you anything different. Jesus says Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. I'd say we ought to believe him. But that's one part of it. The second part is, what's the abomination of desolation? Now, unfortunately for us, as we're going through this, I preached on it about 3 weeks ago. But abomination is the worshiping of anything other than God himself. It is lonesome, has an uncommon stench, it's hated by God, it's detestable by God, and that's always in reference to idol worship. But the abomination of desolation is the most extreme. Desolation, just absolutely everything lost, everything destroyed. It's the most extreme practice of idol worship. And that's where an idol is set up in the most holy place on earth, in the Holy of Holies. In 167 BC, Antiochus IV, he called himself Epiphanes, the Exalted One, he desecrated the Jewish temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar, and he put an image of Zeus inside the Holy of Holies. This started, the Jewish people lost it when he did this. They became furious. It started the Maccabean revolt. And for 3 years, the Jews fought against Antiochus Epiphanes. And subsequently, on his birthday, the 25th of Kislev, they defeated him and purified the temple again. That's worshipped every year, and they even do it to this day, and they call it Hanukkah. And so when you hear of Jews celebrating Hanukkah around our Christmas time, they're actually celebrating when they were able to cleanse and reestablish the temple after the Maccabean revolt, after the pig had been sacrificed on the altar. Excuse me, verse 15. So that's the Abomination of Desolation. Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. But also, one other thing. Notice how Jesus says it. Therefore, when you see. He's talking about something in the future. He did not say, do you remember in your history when, 100 years ago, like less than that, it took place? He doesn't say that. He says, when you see. So not only is he pointing to something that was in their history, he's also pointing to something that's in the future that they are going to see, that we will be able to see. How many of us have seen inside the Holy of Holies? Well, none of us yet, right? Because there's not a temple. So we know that there has to be a temple. We also know that there is no way this could be given, this prophecy could be given in any other time than the one we're living in. Even 100 years before this, we could have never imagined having closed caption TV anywhere we want and to watch something live. Well, this is a prophecy saying for our generation, when we see this take place, an image put up inside the Holy of Holies, just like Daniel spoke back then, you know it's time. I read verse 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Remember, Matthew's writing to the book. He's writing his book to the Jews. And most Christianity, they don't care about Sunday, much less the Sabbath. Here, the Jews still care about the Sabbath. And so he says, you better pray that when this takes place, it's not on your Sabbath, because you only got a Sabbath day's journey you can run. You're not going very far. He's speaking to Jews that are still going to be there at the time. And we'll talk about more of that next week than this week, but that's just for future reference. When we see this take place, he says for the Jews that are in Judea, Jerusalem's down below Judea, he says you want to run, you want to flee to the mountains, and you want to go there as fast as you can and leave everything behind. So whatever's going to take place, it's going to take place in a hurry, a fast hurry. Verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation, such has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor will ever shall be. No, nor shall ever be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened, for false Christs, false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See that I have told you beforehand. When you see this take place, when you see the abomination of desolation, you run and you leave everything behind, because the worst time in all history is about to take place. Jesus says here, it's never been as bad as it will be here in our history. At their time, it's not as bad now as what it will be then. And he then concludes, in the past, the present, and there will never be a time in history that will be worse than this time right here. Abomination of Desolation. You run and hide as fast as you can. Now, here's one of the reasons that we're talking about the end times. He makes sure that you know this isn't something that's just taken place, or that it took place before in the Maccabean revolt. No, this is worse than the Maccabean revolt. This is worse than when Vespasian's going to come in 70 AD. It's going to be worse than that later on. There's nothing going to be comparable to this time of great tribulation. And then he says, unless those days be shortened, humanity would wipe itself out. We couldn't do it back then. In their time, and let's face it, even 150 years ago, we still couldn't have done that. But today's world, China on a regular daily basis does its best to find ways that it might destroy the world or destroy entire nations at a time. This is a message for our times. Something kind of fun though, I don't know about you, but as you get older and you talk to older folks, they would say the things like, you know, the older you get, the faster time goes, and you know, once your kids get into school, time moves up faster. They get into high school and get into college, and they become adults, and then grandkids, and just time, it just shortens. The days seem to shorten. Well, I honestly think that's part of what Jesus is talking about here in verse 22. Unless those days were shortened, no flesh should be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. I really do believe that God is shortening our days in our understanding of time so that humanity doesn't wipe itself out because of our sin. It's not very hard if we had a long extended period of time that we would destroy ourselves as humans. All it takes is one bad dictator and he can wipe out 6 million Jews in a few years. Imagine if he had longer days. Also, it's only in the last 20 years that science has accepted the idea that time is not constant. We've actually found out that time can change depending on mass, acceleration, or gravitational pulls. But think about that. That it's very possible that God himself is changing our time and speeding it up so that we might just make it at the end. How his hand is at work. Verse 26. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Jesus is referring to what he talked about. He says, therefore. He's digging deeper on the comments that he just made about the Great Tribulation. He says there's no worse before, it's not any worse then, and it will not be worse after comparative to this Great Tribulation. It's going to be a time of great and the highest level of deception of all time. It's not the right wording, but you understand what I'm trying to say. There will be no greater deception than in this time of great tribulation. Jesus says, there's going to be all kinds of people who are going to try and deceive you. He says, but the next time I'm showing up like lightning. And I believe that this is talking about the rapture of the church. And I picked up a couple, but there's many more that we could follow. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 51 and 52. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trump will sound, and the dead in Christ will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 16 and 17. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. I believe that Jesus here is talking about his second coming being our rapture. Verse 28, I'll be honest, I was actually talking to Harry and Dad about it. We were both trying to commiserate, and I have not found anybody that has a good understanding of what verse 28 means. For wherever the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. We don't have a clue. Bible scholars don't have a clue. I've often taken it to mean the Romans, because the eagles, they carried them around on their poles. That was their ensign. But that doesn't really match the context of what Jesus is talking about. And if you take the context that the carcasses are the dead, eagles aren't like vultures. They don't eat the dead. They take the live and then eat the live. So that doesn't fit either. Good luck trying to figure it out. You all get something, come back to me. I'm sure there's a bunch of people that like that answer. But verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together all his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to the other. This occasion, notice Jesus gives you another timeline note. He says immediately after the tribulation. Those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars fall from the heaven, power shaken. Then, the sign of the Son of Man appeared. What he's giving you is, this is not him coming like lightning. In fact, this is a very different approach. This is him coming, and the people, all the world, will be able to see him coming and mourn his coming, dread his coming, and they will hide from him. This is totally different than him showing up for the rapture where we meet him in the air. No, this time he's going to show up with power and great glory, and he's going to take his throne. Upon doing that, he's going to gather, verse 31, all of those Jews that were elect, 144,000 in the tribulation. He's going to gather them all to himself. So that's all the further we're going to go tonight on those verses. But I'd like to take you back, because I want you to see the timeline that Jesus says. And I'll be honest, you're probably not going to agree with it. There's a lot of people that don't. And to be honest, I'm kind of close to it. If Jesus in verse 14 is referring to the rapture, and I believe that he is, talking about if they say that he's here or they say that he's there, don't go because he's going to show up like lightning. Okay? If that's referring to the rapture, and we use what Jesus says in the timeline of what the end's going to look like, that's going to mess with some of our ideas about when the rapture takes place. Whether before the tribulation or in the middle of the tribulation. So let's just see what Jesus has to say. Now you can follow along in your Bibles because I don't have the verses there on the screen. But in verse 14, Jesus said, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all of the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." So that's the alarm clock. When that hits, we know that the end is going to come. After that time frame, in verse 15, he talks about the abomination of desolation. We know from other scriptures that there's 3.5 years where the Antichrist fake Trinity makes a deal with the Jews. And in that first 3.5 years, he's all happy-go-lucky. Everybody's all happy about it. And then he puts the abomination of desolation. He puts the image inside the Holy of Holies. Okay? So there's a 3.5 span somewhere between the end taking place, the abomination of desolation. After that, we also know that there's another 3.5 years. Because when that takes place, the abomination of desolation, everything goes to pieces. And he is given power to make war with the saints, and bad things. It's the worst. Verse 21, Jesus, and we're just going down the verses that Jesus gives us. I mean, exactly what he says. Not taking them out of time frame. He says in verse 21, "For then there will be great tribulation." Remember, he says, run. You see the abomination of desolation. Run. That was verses 16 through 20. "There will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be." So at that point, you have 3.5 years. It's going to be a mess. This is the great tribulation. There's no time ever in history that's going to be worse than this one. Okay? So in the middle of that, verse 25, there's going to be false prophets, false Christs. He says don't follow after them. It's going to be a time of great deception. Verse 27, "He will come like lightning." Now, I can't tell you between when verse 27 takes place and verse 21 and verse 14. I don't know the time frame in between those. We do know that there's 3.5 good years. Some believe that the rapture takes place before that time, in the middle of that time, or after that time. But to be totally honest, none of us really know. Because there's good arguments for it all, and there's bad arguments for it all. All of these ideas have holes in them. But if we go with what Jesus says, there will be a great tribulation, unparalleled by any other, or uncomparable to any other time in history. There will be false prophets, false Christ, and his return like lightning to get his people. Then verse 29, that's supposed to say verse 29, I'm sorry. "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken." That, again, this is immediately after the tribulation. That's verse 29, not 21. So we have, these things are going to take place. These are all what's happening beforehand. The earthquakes, the pestilences, the wars, the rumors of wars, all of that's beforehand. They're birth pains. Then the gospel's preached in the world, the end's going to come. At some point after that, we're going to see the abomination of desolation. Immediately after that, there's going to be a terrible time, and you need to run for your lives, and don't stick around and take anything with you. It would be a bad time of false prophets, false Christ. His lightning rapture, again, we don't know when that's necessarily going to be, but after the 3.5 years, immediately after the 3.5 years, they will see Christ. They will see the sun darken, the moon darken, stars fall from heaven. And verse 30, they are going to see him coming, and the whole world is going to mourn because of his coming. Christ, on his return, is going to terrify the world. And then he's going to come for his 1,000-year reign with his power and great glory. And no one will stand against him. So that's the timeline that Jesus gives us in the Olivet Discourse. Whether you believe that we'll be raptured beforehand, before the tribulation, or in the middle of it, again, there's great arguments for any of it. But this is what Jesus gives us if you follow what he said. I say all that to say this. There are great arguments for both. There are great holes for both understandings. Plain and simple, we're not sure when we are going to be raptured out. Nobody really knows. So we need to prepare for the storm that we know is coming. We need to be ready. If he comes at the end of it, in the middle of it, or before it ever happens, we need to prepare for the storm that's coming. We know that this storm is going to be a time of greatest deception, and truth is going to be very hard to find. We need to start today, planting and grounding ourselves in the truth. We may not be threatened with our lives like they are in Afghanistan right away. But I can tell you this, if we make it to this point, if we make it to this storm, whether your life is called into question, your mind certainly will be. And we need to prepare mentally now while it's easy, before it gets difficult and never will. Satan works slyly. He's never blatant and obvious. We like to think that this terrible, awful time is just going to be, wow, we see it, it's there, it's awful. You know, like a hand get chopped off or something. You know, just something, wow, it's terrible. But Satan doesn't ever really work that way. Satan's always worked from a cancer that's within the mind. Whether it was from Eve or Joseph, or not Joseph, excuse me, whether it was Eve or whether it was Joshua or whether it was Moses, any of the ones that had faced temptation, they didn't deal with the immediately bad problem at hand. No, Satan convinced them to walk away. And this is what's going to happen in this great reception. The lies are going to overpower the truth if we don't hold on to the truth. If we don't already have it well established in our lives. And we need to prepare now. We also know that it's going to be the time of greatest persecution in all of humanity. At some point, I do believe if we're in this storm, our lives will be called into question. We will have to make the choice if we're going to serve God or stay in the earth. And again, we have to prepare for that now. Because let's face it, if we're not preparing now by praying constantly, walking daily, if we're not willing to go to church, if we're not willing to memorize His Word, if we can't do these things now when it's easy, when our life is called into question, we're going to fail immediately. And again, it's not going to be something so bold and so ferocious that it's obvious. No, this is a time of deception. This is going to be very easy to be deceived unless we're grounded now. It sounds like dark times. And it's the darkest of times. But in the darkest of times, that's when Christ returns. And there is no one that will stand against Him. I find it interesting, he gave us that verse. I believe it was verse 8 that he said, but those who endure to the end. Revelation says to those that overcome. He's giving us the option. He's giving us the option to prepare now and to outlive then, to last through. He also says in the Scripture that there's no temptation that has taken us much as common to man, and with it He will give us a way of escape that we might be able to bear it. We can endure this great and awful time. But it's not going to be easy. And we need to be prepared now. And if we're not willing to prepare now, expect failure in the future. There's no runners in the high school track team or in the Olympics that just decide one day, yeah, I think I'm going to go for a run and I'm going to win in the Olympics. No, it takes practice and work and striving and struggle. It's blood, sweat, and tears. But when they do that, they prepare themselves for the great event